As I think everyone in this room knows, the Kauffman Foundation, which is headquartered and based here in Kansas City, Missouri, is a sponsor of this event. And one of the key focuses of the Kauffman Foundation, really a series of focuses, are the links, really, between entrepreneurship, access to capital, and the importance of networks to build economies of the future. One of the world experts, one of the true world experts on how to develop the intersection of human and financial talent is Paul Kedrosky. He's here to tell us about it. Please welcome Paul Kedrosky. Paul?
Hey everybody, I'm Paul Kedrosky with the Kauffman Foundation. I can talk a little bit about cities, but do it from a somewhat different point of view and talk a little bit about some of the latest work that we're doing at Kauffman related to cities. And cities is a real passion and a real focus at Kauffman because we think of cities as kind of the atomic units of economic growth. Our focus is on entrepreneurship and economic growth at the foundation. And so this is really, the test bed, the place where we both try out programs and where we find out whether or not they're working. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I think, just to sort of put it in context, and I just saw this on the way out, it's kind of a remarkable way of thinking about it. But of the five fastest growing cities in the world in terms of GDP per capita, how many of the five fastest would you guess are in China? Five fastest in GDP per capita terms, not population, GDP per capita. Anyone want to take a shot? All of them, we have a winner. So all of them are, of course they all are, right? I mean, people are moving rapidly into these urban areas, driving economic growth. This transition from rural to urban areas has always been a driver of economic growth, no surprise. Turn it around, how many of the five slowest growing cities in the world in terms of GDP per capita are in the United States? I tricked you, it's only 3, see? We're doing fantastic. So just using that as a jumping off point, let's talk a little bit about cities and a little bit about some of the latest work we're doing at Kauffman related to the relationship between cities and economic growth. And I like to think of it as a kind of a quest. A lot of the puzzles that we're trying to solve at Kauffman are really quests. We're looking for data, we're looking for information, we're trying to settle arguments in many ways. And one of my favorite quests happens in the fans of The Big Lebowski may recognize this immediately. This is an 8-track Creedence Clearwater tape, which plays a fundamental role in the movie The Big Lebowski. It turns out to be a completely pointless quest, which this one that I'm about to describe to you isn't. But nevertheless, the quest starts off with, for me anyways, with this number 15. And the number 15 is a number that most of you know what this is, right? This is Mark Andreessen. This was, I think, the worst photo I could find. And this, because Mark is a friend, I thought this would be the appropriate photo to use of Mark. He's turned sideways, looks a little puffy. I think it's perfect. So Mark, one of the most successful entrepreneurs probably in the last 20 or 30 years in the United States, started one of the founders of Netscape, went on to do fantastic things with Opsware, a number of other companies, now has probably the fastest growing in terms of entering the top echelon of venture firms in the United States, a firm called Andreessen Horowitz, which he now runs. Now, in the process of raising the funds for Andreessen Horowitz, Mark kept repeating this number, 15. And the number 15 was, Mark claimed, and had said, and supported by many others, but this idea that there were 15 companies that mattered in the United States in any given year. 15 companies that mattered. And the goal, according to Mark for Andreessen Horowitz, was to invest in all 15. And that was a fundamental part of the pitch deck. And it was sort of surprising on 2 different dimensions, right? I mean, this whole idea that there would only be 15 companies that mattered, meaning they got founded in that year, and that come hell or high water, I need to be an investor in those companies, right? Thinking about it as a venture capitalist, looking at an urban area, looking at the companies that emerged. So across the US, there were only 15 companies that matter. And he took it one step further and said that 2/3 of those companies were in the Bay Area. So 2/3 of the 15 companies that matter on an annual basis are in the Bay Area. And that's a really provocative point. And it goes to the core of something we think about a lot at Kauffman, which is young companies as a source of economic growth. As we've probably all heard too many times, if not here in other places, the primary source of new jobs in the United States over the last few decades has been young companies less than 5 years old. So this is something that ties in very closely to what we think, but also changes the way you think about it, because you think, how can there possibly be so few? So let's sort of think about this a little bit. So I did what any sort of self-respecting researcher would do when you're trying to solve a question like this. I emailed Mark, and I was like, what the hell is this? so I emailed Mark. I said, hey, Mark, did you see that I note about the study? Because it was supposedly from a Stanford study. I said, there being 20 to 25 companies. I had it wrong, of course, because I wasn't paying much attention at the time. And any year that matter, I said, is there a source for this somewhere? Or, are you just making this stuff up because it helps to raise money? So of course, Mark, being the lovely fellow that he is, Mark writes back, and it turned out it was proprietary research, which is often a euphemism for we made that up, right? But it's proprietary research from Andy Ratcliffe, who was one of the early partners, I think one of the founding partners at Benchmark, right? One of the big name brand venture capital firms on the West Coast. And it was from some work that Andy had done, according to Mark. And he said, we'd love to see someone publish it. And I said, that's sort of, red meat, right? I mean, I'd love to see someone publish it too. And so, let's find this out. So I tracked down Andy, and I've got possibly the worst email back you can get. so on my quest to discover this fundamental sort of atomic characteristic right up there with G equals 9.81 meters per second squared, one of these sort of fundamental characteristics of economies, I got done in by a hard drive that crashed 5 years ago, according to Andy. So which, if you've been through this sort of thing very often, when you see these kinds of memes that spread with respect to economies, pretty quickly you start to wonder if there's anything behind it at all. There's this sort of famous Maltese falcon, right? It was a Hitchcockian thing that this MacGuffin, right? This thing that everyone chases after that turns out that either it doesn't exist or if it did exist, it doesn't matter, kind of like the 8-track, the Creedence Clearwater 8-track in The Big Lebowski. And so my concern was that maybe there is no there. So I spent a good chunk of the last few months trying to decide if this was a MacGuffin, if there was really something going on, and if there was, how we would ever know. Because there's some really fundamental questions here, right? If you're thinking about it from a city standpoint, what does matter mean anyway, right? I mean, there's a whole kind of echelon of what matter means. Like, I think a company matters because it's from here, right? I mean, that's a very common response. These are our most important companies. These are the companies that matter. Why do they matter? They're from here. Right? These are why they matter. It's bigger than everything else here. So it's not just from here, it's bigger than the other things that are from here. So it's gotta matter, right? It made me money. That's one of the fundamental litmus tests of whether a company matters is whether it ever made you money. And then secondarily, maybe it made other people money. That's pretty good. It made some venture capitalists money. Follow on down the list, Google might buy it, because that's a favorite way of figuring out if something matters. There's rumors it's going to get bought by those Google guys. Google, and then Google did buy it. It's on the Fortune 500 list. It's growing really fast. It's really profitable. All of these, in to one degree or another, viable measures of matter. The measure that turned out that Andy was working from, or that was actually, the idea behind this question of matter, and the one that we sort of bought into as we've been working on this, is that it has 100 million in revenue. It turns out that 100 million in revenue is a really important sort of hurdle as you think about young companies and growing companies. And the reason is because it allows people lots of possibilities, right? If you think about what are some of the outcomes that can happen to companies when they hit 100 million in revenue. You can get bought much smaller, but nevertheless, it's nice to get to that kind of number. It's certainly going to help you get noticed and potentially get bought. It helps because of the changing economics of going public, right? Sarbanes-Oxley and many other pieces of legislation have changed the viability of going public for younger companies, raising the cost, increasing the amount of revenue required before you can go public. So 100 million isn't completely indefensible from that standpoint, right? It helps you to go public, which creates other exits, right? You don't have to rely on venture capitalists or banks or your balance sheet as much anymore. You can grow faster and create more jobs in your region or around the world because you can access the public markets. So I don't want to over-defend this. You may decide that the most important thing that makes a company matters is from where you are, and I say power to you. That's a perfectly legitimate one. It's just not the one we're using here, okay? The one we're using here, when I say a company matters, I'm talking about it having $100 million in revenue, okay? So all of these quest stories, and this is mostly an urging to myself, quest stories can get really bad right in the middle. You start doing all this character exposition, and it's like, enough already. Let's get on. Let's shoot somebody or blow something up. So let's start blowing some stuff up. It's a really great reminder that high-growth businesses, this is not a uniquely IT phenomenon. When Andreessen was talking about this in the context of Andreessen Horowitz, he was talking about IT companies, right? So that's another layer of distinction. It's not just $100 million companies. It's not just companies around the US. It was companies that were largely or entirely in information technology. So he was saying that the companies that were only 15 or 20 or whatever the number we end up coming to that mattered in information technology. It's worth reminding ourselves that that is not somehow, again, some fundamental force or act of nature, right? There's companies in all kinds of sectors that can be high growth and not at all limited to information technology. As a matter of fact, some of the top tier fastest growing companies by selected industry, this is from some, I think this is McKinsey data, but originally based on the Gazelle study from the US Small Business Administration, heavy construction of all things. Now again, that's sort of an artifact of the wacky period we went through leading up to the housing bust, but nevertheless, it's worth reminding ourselves growth can come from anywhere and often does. So what do we know? Well, we know a bunch of things, and I'm going to kind of go through them and try and give you some flavor from what we've learned and looking at all this stuff. Here's one thing that we've learned. We've learned that ignoring sector, right? Ignoring sector, here's a rough sense of the number of companies per year in the United States that reach $100 million by founding year. So in other words, roughly 150 companies, say, in 1977, founded in 1977, out of the 500,000 or so that were founded that year, and less if you take it down to sort of C corporations, but nevertheless, a big number. Not quite like getting struck by lightning, but still improbable enough. 150 companies from that year eventually reached $100 million in revenue, and you can sort of track it forward. So what do we take away from this? What's the grand pattern? The grand pattern over the last 34, 35 years of company creation in the United States is there's not really much of a pattern at all, right? There's no really pattern at all. It's not obvious. As a matter of fact, it's not obvious that we're getting better at it. Maybe it's not enough time. Maybe we need more money. Maybe we need to do more something. But nevertheless, it's not obvious, especially when you consider that the economy is growing larger and the global economy is getting more linked. It's not obvious yet that we're getting better at it. To be fair, there's a bit of a sort of a survivorship issue because we shouldn't expect too many companies from 2010, say, who have already raced to 100 million in revenue. Come on, let's be real. Let's give them time, right? These people have stuff to do. They don't get straight to 100 million in revenue. But nevertheless, this is worth at least contemplating that there are many things that we're getting rapidly better at in modern economies and in modern societies at large, in sports, economics, and elsewhere. Creating $100 million companies does not yet seem to be one of them. So that's really interesting to us as Kauffman. So let's look at this a different way. So now what I did was I took all that data and I said, let's take all of these $100 million companies across the United States and look at them over the last 25 years. And now this is what's called an area cartogram, where you rescale the size of individual states based on a proportion tied to some specific measure, right? You've probably all seen this from the recent US presidential elections, where you saw the maps that showed most of the country being one color and then the rest of the country being another. And then if you rescale based on population, it doesn't look so crazy after all, right? It doesn't look like what it looks like instead is that you see pretty much of a 50-50 split. So this is rescaling the entire US based on the number of $100 million a year companies produced by those individual states over that period, okay? So on a year-by-year founding basis. And what do we walk away knowing? Well, we see where the big guns are, right? We see it's probably California, it's probably Texas, Florida to some degree, Georgia. Certainly New York and New Jersey is, consistent producers of $100 million companies. And, there are some surprises in pockets throughout the country, but it still, nevertheless, really shows, in I think, an interesting and striking way what's going on here. Let's take it down another level. So this is, instead of just thinking of all sectors, this is just tech, okay? Just looking at tech companies produced. So it kind of looks like California ate the rest of the country here, right? I mean, it looks like, oh, it's a big gulp. So this is just tech companies produced by state across the United States at $100 million a year revenue, okay? That eventually reach $100 million a year in revenue over the last 25 years. And it's really striking because, again, what do we see? We see this incredible concentration of sort of company creation wealth that really, it's our gut intuition in many ways that there seems to be an awful lot going on in some places, not very much in others, is really borne out. That so many of these companies are really in a very small number of places. So let's think about why that is and what's really going on here. What might be driving these things? Well, there's kind of a virtuous cycle for sure going on, and we're all painfully aware of that, right? People keep going back to the same places where they can have more collisions, and there's more people who've had this kind of experience, and I can hire more people like that. And California is sort of the canonical example, right? This is from a recent study done by the BLS looking at population growth. This is a radial graph of population growth by decade in California. And what do you see here? California's had some pretty dramatic spikes in population growth, but all being equal, it's actually grown pretty consistently for much of the period. Let's turn that around a little bit. So here's another way of looking at it that I think maybe brings it home a little more. This is population flux, the flow of people into and out of one of the sort of fastest growing entrepreneurial regions or parts of California, which is in sort of Santa Clara County, which includes San Jose, California, and much of Silicon Valley. And what do you see? What's really interesting is it's not all people racing in, and this turns out to be hugely important. This idea of flux, that people crossing kind of a membrane and pouring into and out of regions is hugely important in terms of driving some of this the stuff we're talking about, the creation of these kinds of companies. It's those collisions and those sort of accidents that happen in dense urban areas as people flow into and out of them rapidly that causes it to happen. And what's particularly interesting, if you look at this, is and this is something that's often sort of a revelation to people who are city officials, it's not also always about being a net inbound migration, right? If you look over this period, San Jose was kind of a wash for part of it and also saw outbound migration for a huge part of the period as well. If you look back as far as 1999 and 2000, even pre-dot-com period, you'd see that it was actually losing population. There was more net outbound migration for multiple years in that period. And that's not a bad thing, because if you think about these cities as kind of atomic units or even biological units for economic growth, what are they doing? They're sort of resorting and reassembling, right? People are coming and going and changing and saying, you know what, this is no longer the place it once was. It doesn't present the economic opportunities. And rather than being always so focused on retaining the population we have, one of the lessons of this flux is that sometimes we just have to let it happen. People come, people go, and trying to hold people there and these sort of for vestigial reasons is often not a particularly good idea. I'll flash through a couple of these last ones really quick, because you've gotten the idea, I think, already. Missouri. How much of a resemblance do we have to California? This is population growth by decade. Not much at all, right? It's really changed dramatically. You saw some of the biggest spikes in population more than 100 years ago, and then since then, it's been very much sort of from a population standpoint, a flux standpoint, stasis. And you see that again, comparing this net inbound, outbound migration into this county over the last few years. You see again, there's not drawing from as many places, there's not as much flux. It's dominated by inbound migration, which weirdly enough turns out to be less important than people leaving, which is always a surprise. So it's very different. So this flux is hugely important. So let's go right back to where we started again. So I started talking about this all being driven, this idea of thinking about, how many companies matter in a given year, who creates the wealth, who creates the jobs, this 15. Was the number right? It turns out it wasn't too far off. We'd be publishing a paper on this before too long, but varies, but between 15 and 20 companies a year in IT, US, nationwide, get to $100 million a year in revenues by founding year, which is pretty remarkable, because if you consider, there's this kind of implicit act by venture capitalists and many others around the US that they feel like they can find these companies anywhere in the country, and that's not true. And we might as well bear up to it. It's not true. It hasn't worked out that way at all. Now, if you kind of look at the figures, this is going back to 97. So this is the number per year of tech companies in the United States, private and public, stacked, that have gotten to $100 million a year in revenue or more, obviously. You see the dot-com sort of bubble period was not only good in generating market capitalization, but was surprisingly good at generating companies that created $100 million a year in revenue or more. And as we get back to the middle of the decade, we're seeing return to sort of historical norms, sort of 10 to 15, 20 companies a year crossing both private and public being produced on an annual basis. And as we get out sort of towards the end of the decade, obviously it's too soon to tell. It's nice that we're seeing at least 4 or 5, 6 companies being produced on sort of an annual basis still that have already gotten to $100 million a year in revenue, but the real test will be 5 or 6 years out or further. But the flavor I want to give you is there are only a small number of companies a year that matter. Competing for them, in a sense, is kind of a mug's game, but it's really important to at least understand that that's the economic landscape we see. And so when people start trying to create the idea that we're all competing because we can grow all those companies here too, first off, there aren't that many of them. There only is sort of 15, 20, 30 of these companies, and on an annual basis being created in the United States among the fastest growing tech companies. One of the things at Kauffman we believe passionately is you can increase that number through more experimentation, more cheap starts, more people experimenting with this whole idea of entrepreneurship. And that's a test in a sense that's underway right now with programs like, like Angel List and many of the incubators and accelerators that are out there and all of the young companies that are going through Y Combinator and Techstars. So we'll see. We'll see how that pans out. Maybe we can raise it, but it's worth knowing right now that that number, while it's nowhere sort of set in stone the way sort of universal physical constants are, appears to be a really important number in the US economy right now. Thanks very much.